The third reason that we study urban wildlife is probably the most difficult, and that has to do with conservation. We live on a planet that is urbanizing. Urban areas are expanding. They're probably going to keep doing that for all of our lifetimes. Meanwhile, our model for conservation is preserves. It's to set aside nature reserves far away from these urban spaces and really to cast cities as the villain in our conservation narrative. The idea being that, well, the cities are obliterating the natural habitat, they're leaving nothing behind, and we have to stop them. Well, my view is we can't stop them. That's not going to happen. The human population will continue to increase. We need cities. So the only option is to change that narrative and to try to make cities not just the villains, but actually part of the solution. That's a really steep goal because that means we need to figure out how do we build nature in cities? How do we do that in a way that minimizes conflict? How do we learn enough about these different species we want to conserve to know how to build a space for them in the heart of human habitations? It's not easy, and it involves talking beyond just scientists to folks like landscape architects and urban planners about what would this model of a wildlife inclusive city really look like. So it's difficult, but that's important, we feel, and that's the third reason that we study these urban species. This is, urban wildlife biology is catching on as a discipline among scientists, but there's still, I would say, in the conservation community, a bit of disdain amongst the old guard, a bit of feeling that this isn't important, that these species don't matter, that these are spaces that we should write off. And I get this attitude a lot when I go to conferences or sort of talk to certain types of colleagues, this sort of, oh, you're wasting your time with these urban spaces. But what I always try to remember is the general public does not feel that way at all, because most of the general public lives in some urban or suburban type of area, and they're very interested in their local wildlife. They're interested in the species they see, the things they do. They want to know more about it. And if you read any sort of nature blogs or, even just follow social media for stuff about nature and wildlife, you'll see this all the time. Urban wildlife is top of mind for many, many people. This is really when I knew that was true, as when I saw this article in The Onion. For those of you who don't know, The Onion is not real. This is a satirical newspaper. And when they started running stories about urban wildlife, like this one about Obama's Camp David summit with coyotes, I was like, okay, the general public gets it. They really care about these urban species. This is something that I think we can get behind in a big way, not just in sort of a limited nerdy science way. Also, I think this would be a great summit, and I would like to go to it. So those are the main pillars that underlay this center that I direct, the Urban Wildlife Institute. We are one of 6 research centers at the Lincoln Park Zoo, and really our focus is to try to do the research necessary to help people and wildlife coexist in cities all around the world. So most of our work takes place in Chicago. For those of you who don't know, the third largest urban area in the United States. But as I'll talk about, we actually have gone beyond Chicago now these last little while. But like I said, I'm going to give you a brief history lesson. I promise it won't be too boring. Lost my animation. But I want to give you just a sense of how we scaled up what we were thinking about when it came to these urban species, because I think it's kind of instructive. Oh, I had a cool animation there and it's not working. Can I get it to go? I'll give it a second. Yeah, here we go. Okay, worth waiting for. We're going to zoom into Chicago. Like I said, putting it in context. And you can kind of see where the zoo is for those of you who know Chicago at all. We're quite close to downtown, as you could kind of see in that little zoom in. So when we started this center about 13 years ago, we had a sort of a fortunate event, which is at the same time, the zoo was thinking real hard about what to do with this pond that's just outside the zoo, but which the zoo manages just to the south of us. This is what that pond looked like in 2004. It's a pretty basic concrete lined paddleboat pond. You got ducks, you got geese. People are kind of paddling around. Very human focused use, not wildlife focused at all. And I think if you went back in time in this pond, what you would find is that in the 1890s, it was pretty much the same pond. It had not really changed in over 100 years. The boats are a little different. People are wearing better hats, but other than that, pretty much the same space. But the zoo was starting this urban wildlife center that I was a part of, and they said, well, maybe we have a real opportunity here. If we're going to talk about helping people coexist with wildlife, nature spaces, and cities, can we do that? Can we do that to sort of as a proof of concept to show, like, does this idea even work at a local scale? So we brought in a really good horticulture staff. We tore out all of the ornamental grasses and stuff. We replanted the whole thing with to make it sort of a native prairie sedge type of pond. We took out all the trees, which upset a lot of people initially, I can certainly tell you. But it is a pretty cool site now, and this is what it looks like from the air right now. We built a lot of boardwalks, but a lot of this space was designed not with humans, but with wildlife in mind. And we did introduce some species, but a lot of more species just kind of found it over time. And my staff continues to manage and monitor all of the wildlife across this site. But you can see again from this aerial shot just how close we are to downtown Chicago. So this is a site that is surrounded by really high intensity urban development. And we see phenomenal diversity, even at this tiny little, I think it's about maybe 10-acre little pond. Hundreds and hundreds of bird species during migration. We're on a major migratory pathway along the shore of Lake Michigan. Mammals, invertebrates, many different species of bats, turtles, a few frogs. I'd like to see more frogs, but just to make the point that even in this postage stamp of a nature space right next to downtown Chicago, we have enormous success in creating wildlife diversity. And it's not just that. We also have enormous success connecting the public to that space. We train dozens of interns at this site every year in how to handle wildlife, how to study them, how to manage them. We run little workshops and educational programs to try to connect people to the space, which have also been wildly successful. So Nature Boardwalk has been, at this, again, very local scale, really successful experiment towards this goal. And the crowning achievement of it is these guys. So some of you are probably birders. These are black-crowned night herons. Globally a pretty common bird, but in Illinois, actually a state endangered species. This is the largest remaining colony of these birds anywhere in the state of Illinois. Actually nests every year all around Nature Boardwalk. They have chosen that as the place to make their stand. And to me, that really illustrates that we can do conservation in urban areas. It's not just about management. We can conserve rare things if we just put in the time and the effort to build the space for them. So at a very local scale, as I said, this worked, but that meant we then had to think harder about scaling back and really think hard about what's the kind of information we would collect across a huge city like Chicago that actually would be useful to figure out how to manage wildlife, how to live with wildlife, how to create these wildlife inclusive cities we keep talking about. And we talked about this for a long time and sort of different scientific models of hypothesis testing or not, kind of figuring out how are we going to science this enormous question of urban wildlife when we start really from almost nothing. It's such a new science. It's such a young science. There's so little known about these urban species. What we eventually came up with is we said, okay, we're not going to do one study. We're not going to master knowledge of one species. We're going to create an observatory network. We're going to build this massive system of field sites all across the metro area that we monitor as many species as we can for as long as we can to really understand how different aspects of the urban built environment, different levels of urbanization, for example, influence species differently. So all these colored dots you're seeing on this map, those are field sites that we have all across the Chicago metro area. Some of them, the orange ones, are right downtown, but then they radiate out to the southwest, west, and northwest through areas that are urban and then suburban and then eventually exurban to a little tiny bit rural at the extreme edges of these roughly 30-mile long, 50-kilometer transects. What we do at these sites, we measure wildlife and we cast as broad a net as we can. And I mean a couple different things by that. One is we gather data in all seasons. So we're not just collecting data in the summer. We're out there in the winter. We're out there in all seasons collecting data on different wildlife species. And we're using many different technologies so that we can gather data on as many species as we can. So where we have the most data is with camera traps. We use a lot of camera traps across these sites. These give us good data on medium to large size mammals that walk past the camera, but we are also collecting data on insects using pitfall traps, on birds using both bird counts, but also a little bit of mist netting at some of these sites to actually capture birds. We do vegetative surveys at these sites. We study bats using acoustic devices that can record the echolocation calls of the bats. We actually use acoustic devices for birds as well. We even have brought in experts to, for example, we work with an urban ant guy who has looked at ants across all of these different sites. The sites are really in four main categories. We do this research in different types of green space, including forest preserves, golf courses, city parks, and cemeteries. Obviously, cemeteries, golf courses, those are not built for wildlife, but wildlife find them and they use them. So they are a part of our study. And then as I'll talk to you about later, we also partner with schools to collect some data on the sites of those schools. I get excited about the sites you might not think. So like this is a nice buckthorn invaded forest preserve where I'm setting up a camera trap in this picture. But the thing about that is other people have studied wildlife in the forest preserve. So I like doing that, but it's not really like new ground. paradoxically, this is new ground. When I set up a camera trap underneath the train in a very small little postage stamp of a park in the heart of Chicago, that's a space no one has really studied wildlife before, even though thousands of people may visit the site every single day. So a question I always come prepared to head off. Well, here, that's right. First, I'll show you just a few images of the kinds of things that we get. We get deer and, raccoons, and I love this raccoon opossum standoff picture. Sometimes we get multiple species in one shot, which is always fun. Many, many coyotes. Chicago has a very robust population of coyotes and opossums. We get lots of Virginia opossums, but even some rarer species you might not expect, things like mink, which I always kind of like to watch. But yeah, so people always ask me, don't you just have all your stuff get stolen? How do you put out science stuff in the city and you don't lose it? It's a thing, it's a factor. So like these little Jedis don't look very scary, but they actually broke 2 of my cameras. So this happens. We lose some of our equipment, but in the end, it's just not as bad as anyone thought or enough to stop us from doing our work. I think over 13 years of doing this study, our average rate of equipment loss per deployment is about 2%. So about 2% of the time we will lose our stuff when we put it out. Another challenge, of course, in urban areas or any research project is when you have a species that's hard to identify. That does happen, as in this case. This is a dude wearing a Halloween mask on purpose just to mess with us, so that happens. But one thing that a decision we made early on in the study is that humans and their pets, they're part of the study. So when we detect a person on a camera trap, that goes into our database as a human detection. That's because one of the major driving factors in where wildlife go and where they live is where the humans are. They're very attuned to us, our movements. We dominate the system. We can't understand urban ecosystems without understanding humans as a part of it. So we've been doing this for a long time. This is the largest urban wildlife study ever conducted now, certainly, and this is really just the camera trap part of it that I'm sort of bragging up in this slide. But certainly this is the largest urban wildlife study ever conducted in the world, which is pretty exciting and a little bit unusual that it was launched by a small free zoo in Chicago. I'm not going to put you to sleep by walking you through like all the research papers that we've published from this, but just a few key results to give you a sense of the kinds of things we can learn from these data. We've looked at opossum dynamics in a lot of detail. In urban areas like Chicago, opossums are very tied to water sources, not the case in their natural habitat, so that's kind of interesting. We have looked at different neighborhoods as far as, for example, wealthier versus poorer neighborhoods to see how that influences wildlife distribution, and it does affect it quite heavily. Coyotes and raccoons in Chicago both key right in on wealthy neighborhoods, actually, which is kind of interesting. Don't know why exactly, but that is the case. We have looked at different types of green space to see which different wildlife communities live, for example, in parks versus cemeteries versus golf courses, and we have found that they're very different. Each of those types of urban green space attract very different wildlife communities. We have looked at predator-prey dynamics, for example, between coyotes, deer, and rabbits within Chicago. And what we find is that whereas we would expect to not see deer and rabbits where we would see coyotes, in urban areas, we actually very often see all of them together. Again, not like you would see in natural habitat, but our thinking is it is so difficult to move between habitats in the city because of roads and concrete and buildings that if you are a deer or a rabbit, it may be worth it just to try to live with your predator or avoid them at the very local scale rather than actually try to get away from them by moving great distances. All of these studies, I think, illustrate the general theme of what we learn is that the ecological rules that we have discerned through years of work in forests and deserts and grasslands and prairies, those rules really don't apply well in cities. Almost everything breaks down if you really investigate it because the system is so different. I mentioned earlier, we do study bats in Chicago as well. We have 7 species of bats in Chicago that we are interested in. Because bats echolocate their insect prey, we can use devices that can detect those calls and then tell us which species actually has flown by, which is pretty exciting. And we can build maps like these for each different species of bat to see which part of the city is sort of attracting different bats. As with bats throughout North America, many of our species are affected by white nose syndrome, so they're really in decline. And we want to have a good sense of how they're doing and where they're located. And we study many more species. I don't really have time to go into those, but we study small mammals such as mice, voles, and shrews, which we usually have to actually catch in live traps. We have been studying ticks a lot lately. There's a lot of Lyme disease and other diseases that affect humans that are carried by ticks in this area. We want to try to protect both human and wildlife health by getting a sense of where those diseases are distributed. And we're doing a lot of bird work these days using acoustic devices that actually detect bird song and trying to get a sense of how the bird community in Chicago has changed. The fun thing there is there's data going back hundreds of years on bird species, so we can look to see how urbanization has influenced those communities. We host a project funded by the National Science Foundation called the Chicago Rat Project. The pest control company Orkin has called Chicago America's rattiest city. Not a title we are super pumped about, but we do have a lot of rats. And we're trying to study why we have so many rats, how they create human health concerns, which communities suffer the most from rats. And you will not be surprised to learn that in most cases it is the poorest communities and the communities of color that really suffer from these rat infestations. And trying to use ecology to understand how is it that we can control these rat populations and reduce this conflict. But we are also, as I said, the second pillar of the reason we study urban wildlife is to connect it with the public. We do that in a couple different ways, well, several different ways, but I'm going to talk to you about two. One is a program called Partners in Fieldwork. I mentioned before that one of our types of field sites are schools. Partners in Fieldwork is a program where we go to middle schools and high schools in underserved communities around Chicago. We give them all the fun science toys that we use. We give them camera traps, we give them bat monitors and bird monitors, we give them binoculars. And we give them training in how to use those things and identify local wildlife. And then we transform their school into one of our field stations, which is great for me because I get more data. But it's probably more important that it helps to expose kids to STEM careers and teach them about local urban wildlife that maybe they would not otherwise be familiar with. So this has been a very successful program. It won the top education award from the Association of Zoos and Aquariums a few years back. And it's just something we're really proud to host. Another public outreach program we have that you all can be a part of, if you like, is Chicago Wildlife Watch. Chicago Wildlife Watch is a web-based platform we built with a program called Zooniverse and the local planetarium, the Adler Planetarium. Chicago Wildlife Watch, it's a website. If you go there within 3 or 4 clicks, you will be looking at images of wildlife from our camera traps, and there'll be a little thing on the right where we're asking you to identify what is the animal you're seeing in that picture. This is a critical step for us to get our data ready for analysis. It's very, very hard for us to go through these millions of photos ourselves, so we enlist the public to do it, which is great. Again, I get my data, so I'm a happy scientist. But again, more importantly, I think we're helping teach people how to tell these species apart and give them a sense of what kind of animals live in your neighborhood that maybe you should be keeping an eye out for. So yeah, as I said, if you're bored, even if you've only got 2 minutes, you can tag a couple photos on chicagowildlifewatch.org. But now we come to the third pillar of this, which was the conservation, urban planning part of it. How do we build wildlife-friendly cities, right? That's really hard. It's a really big task. So when we started thinking about that, we had to start talking to politicians. I'm talking to a congressman here, Congressman Mike Quigley, about wildlife-friendly cities. We started sitting on a lot of panels about how Chicago gets built and developed, becoming part of programs like the Chicago Nature and Wildlife Plan, local developments. So there's one called the Wild Mile right by the zoo. It's a huge development that we are trying to make more wildlife friendly. Actually, recently I've been talking a lot with folks from the Obama Presidential Center. This is like the Obama Library equivalent that's being built in South Chicago. We want to make that a wildlife friendly, wildlife inclusive structure, which will be a big job too. Actually, recently the city of Chicago asked us to help them write a new wildlife management and coexistence plan for the city in conjunction with the Animal Care and Control Department. So this was very exciting because we got to use our research directly to figure out how do we tell animal control officers how to respond to these calls that people make? How do we tell the public what to do when they see animals in unexpected locations? So that was very gratifying and fun. And there's already kind of been some media that has suggested that it has reduced conflict a little bit. Sort of skeptical of that because we kind of just wrote it, but people at least seem excited about it, and that's a good sign. But now we got to scale up again, because when we started talking to urban planners and landscape designers and all these folks, that's when we realized that only having data from Chicago was really, really limiting us, because I could talk all day about the best way to build, a nature preserve for black-crowned night herons in Chicago. But if someone calls me and says, yeah, well, is that going to work in Pittsburgh? I have no idea. because I don't have data in Pittsburgh, right? And as a scientist, that's not a limitation that I can bluff my way past. We can't claim to have the information we need to build a wildlife-friendly planet when we only have data about a wildlife-friendly Chicago. So after a lot of soul searching about that, we realized, well, we need more data from more places. And that led us to create this alliance called the Urban Wildlife Information Network, or often I'll just say UN. You'll hear me say UN. That's what I mean, is this alliance. And really put simply, what this is people in different cities around the world, but right now mostly the US and Canada, but eventually we hope all around the world, who have adopted the study design that I just told you about, the field stations that where we study many different species for a long period of time along these what we call gradients of urbanization. They're doing that in their own cities. And then together, we're all pooling our data into a big bucket that enables us to answer wildlife questions, not just at a local scale, but at a regional and then a global scale. And this idea, kind of to my shock, took off very quickly. So after we added a few partners across the Midwest, people got very excited to be a part of this. And actually at this point, UN is represented by 47 cities. 44 of those are in the US and Canada, but then there are 2 German cities and 1 South African city that are also part of UN. Yeah, here's the current map of kind of where the partners are located. So this is a truly, we had the biggest urban wildlife data set in the world when it was just Chicago. As UN, we have a data set that no one has ever even imagined anything close to this size, which is very exciting because it enables us to get at these big conservation questions that I was telling you about. Right now, mostly the partners are using camera traps. That's kind of where we started, and that's where most of them have started. But we are hopeful that in time, they are going to, as we did, layer on data on bats, data on birds, data on bugs, data on plants, so that we will have this truly globally biodiverse urban data set at the end of the day. And it's exciting for me as a scientist for a bunch of reasons. One is now I can study species that we don't even have here, right? So like in Chicago, we don't have urban bears or moose, but some of our partners do. So now I have access to data on those things, mountain lions too. So that's very exciting just for that, just to open up that pool of where we can ask questions. So just to kind of give you a sense of like how this expands the questions you can ask, if you're starting on one city, you can ask questions like, hey, why don't I see gray foxes on my street anymore? We were just talking before the call started, Marie and I, about you guys have gray foxes. We have pretty much none left in Chicago, and we don't know why. Those questions are useful locally, but if we can ask questions like at a national scale, then we can ask questions like, why do we have different populations of mesocarnivores? Why do you guys have more gray foxes than we do? If we have data from both cities, we can start to ask that. And as the data set becomes global, we can ask questions like, well, how would we build cities to better support medium-sized carnivores, mesocarnivores? And that is where we want to get to. All right, so I always get asked this question. So again, heading it off, people are like, oh, you have all this data from all these North American cities. Like, what's the most common species? Who's the winner? Who's the urban wildlife winner among the things you catch on camera traps? Well, and I can tell you, you will probably not be surprised to know it is the raccoon. It is always the raccoon. It is never not the raccoon. They are so good at using those weird little thumb things that they have to open our trash. And yeah, trash pandas, what are you going to do? But yes, across the cities in North America that have raccoons, and across things we catch on camera traps. So there's not birds, right? And not like mice. It is raccoons. But like I said, what's really exciting here is now we can do a lot of really complicated statistics and math, frankly, to understand why do different species thrive in different cities or even in different neighborhoods of those cities. What is it that causes foxes to thrive in some places, not others, or squirrels or raccoons? We can ask these questions over and over, species by species, city by city, until we really understand it at this really broad scale that we can use to turn around and create these blueprints for wildlife inclusive cities. So this is a pretty cool data set. We have a lot of data now in it. We're writing a lot of papers. We're adding more sites. It lets us do things like, for example, address weird things that happen in our world, like COVID, for example. COVID hit and everybody started asking like, oh, what's happening with the animals? Like, we're all staying inside as we were for a while. Are the animals responding? There were all these sort of news articles about it that were kind of speculative. Some of them were completely made up, by the way. So some of the urban wildlife stories you read during COVID were not true. You might have read the one about like, oh, dolphins are clogging up the canals of Venice now. That was not true. That was made up. But we were around before COVID, during COVID, and hopefully one day if there's an after COVID, we'll be around then too. So we will be able to address that in our data set and say which species responded to it, which species increased maybe their movements and which decreased them. And then more critically, how can we use that information? Because if humans moving around less is good for certain species, well, that's something we can do something about. We can create more, spaces within parks that don't allow humans or that don't encourage humans or something like that. That's something we can actually directly control. And it's not just the science that actually gets more powerful when we network together, the outreach and the student connections do too. So UN has a lot of different educational repositories, ways to connect students to the data we collect. On the left side of the slide, you're actually seeing the exact same program being delivered in Chicago on the top, Iowa City in the middle, and Austin, Texas on the bottom. That Partners in Fieldwork program I told you about that we developed in Chicago to give schools and students like stuff and make them into a field site. St. Louis thought that was a good idea, so they picked it up and ran with it. And now St. Louis has a very similar program going on in their own city. So anytime anybody in the network has a good idea, there's a chance it will spark somewhere else too. And that goes for outreach as well as science. So some of the next steps for this network, just to kind of give you a teaser, maybe if I give another talk to you all in a couple of years, hopefully what I'll be telling you about. We're doing a really good job on big mammals with these camera traps, but the next step to me is birds. These acoustic devices that can record birdsong have gotten so cheap and so small, we can put them almost anywhere. We are currently piloting a project where we put these audio mouth devices out across, I think it's 10 or 15 of our UN cities, just to get a sense of how urban birds are being affected. It's tricky because cities are noisy, that's what we're finding, but we're trying to work our way past that and use these acoustic devices to collect a lot of data on songbirds. We're creating plans for coexistence. I told you about the Chicago Wildlife Management Coexistence Plan, but we are also actively talking to folks like landscape architects, urban planners, to try to understand what are the barriers to building more science into what they do. What are the barriers to, for example, talking about if you're going to build a building or a neighborhood, why don't we talk about wildlife the same way we talk about, for example, energy? Why isn't there a system like LEED Gold, LEED Silver, LEED Platinum? Why isn't there something like that for wildlife inclusivity? That's where we want to eventually get to. We are working on websites and resources for people, everything from individual homeowners to those kind of designers and architects that really will provide our science in hopefully an easily digestible format so that people can understand what they can do at all different scales to better live with wildlife in cities. And in the end, what we want is this network to be truly global. We have sort of a foothold in South Africa and in Germany right now, but we're always talking to new partners all around the world to try to make sure that this concept catches on, because we really believe this is the next step for urban wildlife biology. There are a lot of individual urban wildlife researchers around the world, but mostly they're still working in their one city, understanding things at that one local scale, which is important. But I believe we can't get to a wildlife inclusive planet that way. We have to talk together. We have to create these really big data sets. And so that's where our focus is. As I said, I think earlier in the talk, the world will not stop becoming urban overnight. Urbanization is here to stay. And I think that we need to go beyond, as conservationists or ecologists, talking about how terrible that is, to talking about what an opportunity that is and what we can do with all the energy of the humans in those cities, the nature spaces in those cities. How do we celebrate the triumphs, those species that can live in those spaces, but at the same time, reduce the conflicts, reduce those negative interactions between people and wildlife. Way back in a Sam County Almanac, so in the 40s, Aldo Leopold said the weeds in a city lot convey the same lesson as the redwoods. We can do so much connection to nature, even in people's backyards, if we really just try a little bit. I think we really just have not put in the effort and the work in a lot of places. And when you do, at least in my case, I found it to be incredibly rewarding. And we've been very successful at connecting researchers together across these urban spaces, but also connecting the public and the people who live in those spaces to the nature that they are a part of. So yeah, I just want to thank some of the many partners that make this network go, which are universities, government agencies, other zoos, NGOs. It's just amazing how many people have come together into this effort. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. Let's see, did I leave? Yeah, I always leave you with this in my background too, but this is my mosaic image of a coyote made out of other images of a coyote. So we took many detections of coyotes from across the network. So all those little boxes, those are coyotes, and then we pieced them into this one big coyote. So if you remember nothing else about my talk, this is what we do. We take snapshots of information into the lives of urban animals all over the world, and we piece it together into something that we hope will help us to know how to better coexist with these animals on our planet. So if this work is interesting to you, you can always follow us on Twitter. There's a website for the network. And yeah, thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Seth. That was a really fantastic presentation. It's amazing to hear what you and your team and your partners are doing. The data that you have is incredible. So yeah, we have some questions in our chat, but I would encourage other folks to raise your hand and feel free to unmute yourself and ask as well. But maybe we'll start with some of the questions in the chat. Actually, we had a comment first mentioning FIPS, and a principle of the Living Building Challenge is regenerative design. So being able to restore the landscape in which these buildings are built. And so FIPS has a few Living Building Challenge certified buildings. And I think that's a really good point, that a lot of the green building designs are thinking about the landscape and the interactions between humans and wildlife. And this actually reminded me, in your talk too, Seth, that paper you published with landscape architects, there is I'm curious if you're familiar with the Sustainable Sites certification, which is focused on the landscape around a building. And it has a number of goals to focus on the health of the surrounding landscape. So you can't use pesticides, herbicides. I think I might be a little outdated here, but some of the plans have to come within a 300-mile radius of the site, which can be, I feel like that's a little controversial in some ways. But have you, and that really thinks about the landscape and wildlife as well. It perhaps may not be wildlife centric, but wildlife are certainly part of that conversation. I'm curious if perhaps you could expand on that.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. Thank you for that, Sarah. So, and I don't want to make it specifically about your structure or even specifically about Sustainable Sites Initiative, but in general, I think that architects and planners are thinking a lot about green stuff and infrastructure stuff, which is great. It's a step in the right direction. And like in Chicago, there's a lot of green roofs. There are even some green walls and living buildings. The part I get frustrated with is I go to those folks and I'm like, so you have this thing and it says on your website it's good for wildlife. And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, can I study it? Can I put a camera trap on it? Can you let me do a before and after to see what species are responding? They get really squirrely then. They're like, well, it's green, it's good for wildlife. And I'm like, well, some wildlife probably, but why don't we find out which and how we can do that better? I'm becoming a little frustrated. I think there's a fear that like I'm going to jump in and find out that it's bad, which is not my goal. And I don't think it probably is bad. But the wildlife biologists are not a part, for the most part, of these architectural and design initiatives. And I think we need to be, because I think we have something to contribute that I think could be really important. So I think these initiatives are great. And I try to stay aware of them as much as I can. But my soapbox is to try to get the science in there. And I'm always begging, like, when you're doing a project like that, please let me in before, during, and after. And I won't charge you anything. Like, that's the other thing. They're like, I don't have any more budget. I'm like, I will do it for free. I just want to know, what did you attract? What did you not attract? What worked well? What didn't work well? And I have hit so much pushback trying to do that. We are doing that now with the Obama Presidential Center site, which is exciting. I really want to see what happens there, but that's like a 7-year project, so I won't have my answer for a long time. But yeah, so that's where I'm at with that. I think all that stuff is great. I want to quantify it because I'm a scientist, and that's, I guess, how my brain works. But I want some more hard data.
Sure. Yeah, that's really valid. And I hear you with wildlife biologists not really being part of that conversation. I think that's right. And we talk about green building certifications a lot, and it's not so much, we rarely hear from wildlife biologists, so they certainly need to be part of that conversation. Yep. And yeah, even Sustainable Sites, we talk with our horticulture team a lot, and they have a lot of questions and concerns, and there's a lot of policies in that certification that we were wondering how they came to those conclusions. Anyway, that I don't want to take away from the other folks who have joined us here and their questions, but yeah, there's a lot to be discussed there. Okay, so Penn asks, what do you do after you capture birds and insects? What happens to them?
Ooh, the answer is very different. Yeah, so birds, when we mistnet birds, usually to collect a little bit of, sometimes we ban them and then to collect a little bit of blood often for disease monitoring and sampling, they are released. They're released live. I'm sad to say that usually not the case for insects. Sometimes it is. So we do visual surveys like at the boardwalk for things like dragonflies and bees, bees and wasps and things like that. But when we are sampling insects across, our field sites, which we haven't actually done in a few years now, but we did do quite a bit of, the state of the art, sadly, is still pitfall traps, which are lethal, right? So they crawl into this little, basically Dixie cup that you bury, and then they die in there in some alcohol. I don't love that, right? I don't feel great about that. We're a zoo. We are always trying to be on the cutting edge of animal welfare. It's just extremely difficult to study, small non-flying invertebrates in a non-lethal way right now. I kind of hope we can get there. There's a lot of people using camera traps in really creative ways now, for example, to like point them down at the ground and set them to really high sensitivity, mostly for like small mammals, for like mice and snakes too. People do that for like snakes and lizards. That's encouraging. And something like that probably could also work for insects someday. But that's actually part of the reason we haven't done more insect work, frankly, is because it's difficult to do non-lethal insect collection.
Thanks, Seth. Bob has his hand up. Bob, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Seth, Bob
Hey, Bob.
Mulvihill. I work at the National Aviary in Pittsburgh.
Oh,
I
great.
absolutely loved your talk. I love your enthusiasm. I love what you're doing and want to talk to you about it more than I can on this forum.
Shoot me an email.
I did see something recently where malaise traps were for catching insects were outfitted with digital cameras, and insects were actually essentially instantaneously identified using some of the technology available
Yeah,
in
some of the
the
ML
IMAP.
tools. Cool.
Yeah, so that may be coming. I mean, I agree.
Yeah, I
It's
wouldn't do
possible.
another pitfall trap study now, frankly. Like I said, that was
Yeah,
several years ago, and I
I
didn't
hear
feel great
you.
about it. And yeah, you're right. I mean, back when we did that, things like Seek and the other sort of automatic like phone apps that ID stuff did not
They,
exist.
they weren't
There's
there.
got to be a better way to do it. So yeah,
Right.
that would be great if you want to send me that paper or whatever, and just in case we start getting a wild hair to do some more invertebrate sampling, that'd be great.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if I can find the source or not. The other thing I wanted to just ask you about is, I worked for about 7 or 8 years here in Pittsburgh as a partner site with the Smithsonian's Project Nest Watch. Are you familiar with that?
A little bit.
So it had the same urban to rural gradient that you're talking about. It was basically a 50-mile diameter around the downtown area of Pittsburgh. We had up to, at the maximum, about 150 cooperating backyards across that landscape gradient, but it required a site, an all day and all morning site visit at each and every one of those. So my other question really has to do with how are you pulling this off with respect to staffing and funding? And are you coming up on any bottlenecks there? Or are you managing better than we were able to?
Oh yeah, I mean it's the primary expense. The equipment, frankly, is not all that expensive. Camera traps and audio detectors are pretty cheap. The real expense is you got to pay somebody to go deal with all this stuff.
Sure.
So I mean, because I'm constantly trying to recruit people into the network, and if they can't do it, I mean, very rarely do people tell me like this is a terrible idea. Usually it's like, yeah, sounds great. I don't have anybody free to do that, and I don't have a source of funds for that. So I feel extremely gratified that the zoo has worked with me all these years to keep myself and my staff employed. For the last 13 years, that we're a free zoo, so we don't have any admissions. So we have to generate all of that through grants. We get grants from places like National Science Foundation, but we also get a lot of money from private philanthropic foundations here in Chicago that the zoo works closely with. As the director of the institute, that's my job. My job is to sing for our supper, and then I employ a lot of great scientists who do most of the cool science that I showed you today. So it's not easy, and each partner has their own model for it. So a lot of our partners are universities, and in those cases, typically it's either graduate students or undergraduates who are running around managing these camera traps and equipments, and then using that as part of a thesis or, you know, a project. Other nonprofits like us are scrambling for funds the same way we are. Government agencies, if we're the few we're lucky enough to work with, I have no idea how they decide, yes, this is worth this you know, this biologist, government biologist time, but somehow they move that up the chain and get it done. So everybody's got their own model for it. We have lost a few partners where they've just said, we don't have the funding, we can't continue this. And that's hard to see, but I guess it's not different from funding anything in conservation, right? It's just hard. It's just hard work.
Yeah.
Let's see, we have a couple other questions on here. Seth, is there a peer-reviewed journal or professional platform where you publish your research studies? I mean, I guess for your average citizen, probably need to find open access journals. Are there any that you recommend in particular?
Yeah, well, that comes right back to the conversation we were just having, because it's about funding. Yeah, we publish open access whenever we can because we want this data to get out as widely as possible, but it's very expensive. It's expensive to publish closed access, but it's very expensive to publish open access. So like any scientist at a university or whatever, we publish in different journals, depending on how cool we think a finding is. We'll try to hit a big journal. I can send you some open access articles that we've published if people are really interested. That one that I think I flashed up there about sort of working with architects and designers and the barriers to those collaborations, that's open access in, I believe, People in Nature is the journal that's in. There's an article really about the foundation of the network and how we all work together that's in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment, and that's open access. But yeah, it's not easy. There's kind of an interesting, like, if you're kind of on the outside looking in the academic world, there's an interesting sort of hack that's not that hard, which is the scientist sort of social networking thing is ResearchGate. If any of you know this website, ResearchGate is sort of how scientists track each other's publications and stuff. And on ResearchGate, if you send somebody a message and you're like, hey, I liked this article you wrote, but I can't get it, we all send them to each other. So if you get on ResearchGate and you write me and you're like, hey, I want this paper, but this journal is asking me for $40 for it, I can send it to you. Now I think you're supposed to be a researcher to be on ResearchGate. I don't know how they assess that or check that, but that's something you could try. I send people a lot of articles on ResearchGate.
Yeah. Also, I'm not sure, I can't remember who asked that question, but if you search on Google Scholar, and Google Scholar will find the open access publications for you. Not all of them are, but again, like if you can't find them there, then you can maybe find the researcher on ResearchGate, email them, and they'll probably send you a copy.
Yeah. And I think on our website for the network, which is this website that's on this slide, if you go there and you go to our like literature site, if it is open access, I think we just put a hyperlink on it. So if you click on it, you'll just get it. But yeah, but they're not all open access, unfortunately.
Yeah. Seth, do you have any relationships with urban foresting efforts?
Not as much as I'd like. I know some urban foresters in Chicago, and we kind of sit in on the same kind of meetings, and we have sort of the same goals and objectives. But yeah, probably should be talking more with urban foresters. They sort of get involved when the park district or someone like that has some park that they're like, we want to make this a nature space. Then they bring in their foresters, and often we're like sitting around the same big table talking about like, you know, how should this be designed for different types of species? And then they're the ones who know exactly what trees are good for what birds. And then I just sit back quietly because I don't know that. But yeah, it would be, those would be good collaborations for us to deepen.
Yeah. Yeah, we work on some things with the Morton Arboretum. So
yeah, Morton's great. Obviously, you know, Chicago seems like a great example of all the different types of conservation organizations, because Morton is good, and then Chicago Botanic Gardens is also great. And yeah, lots of good plant people around.
Yeah. And then another question was, oh, where was it? Do you have any interface between iNaturalist and Urban Wildlife Watch?
Yeah, no, not directly. You know, iNaturalist is great, and we've got an iNaturalist, whatever they call it, team or page or site for our network. And you know, that's a database that a lot of people who kind of are thinking like I'm thinking are drawing from, because they're like, oh man, I got this question and I want to pull data from a wide area. How am I going to do that? Well, I can go to iNaturalist or eBird, and I can pull a ton of data. And that's cool, and that's the way to do it. The reason we don't just do that, the reason we have this network collecting data is because I really believe that systematic data collection is going to get us further than just sort of opportunistic citizen science data. And there's a lot of publications right now coming out that are demonstrating, probably to no one's surprise, that these sites, when you look at where their data are coming from, it's heavily biased to sort of wealthy white communities, places where a lot of people who care about nature live. And so it leaves us with these blank spaces in other parts of the city. And that's why we created this sort of systematic design that we're trying to get people in other cities to use. That said, in aggregate, there's a lot more data on iNaturalist or eBird than we have, even if it's not specifically tailored and focused to urban wildlife the way we are. So periodically we talk about sort of trying to compare those data sets and sort of using them to maybe fill in gaps that we have. I have a postdoc coming on soon that I think is interested in looking at that. So that might be a big part of her research project. But yeah, we haven't really had the time and energy to interface those two big data sets the way we maybe would like to.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. Are there any more questions out there for Seth?
I had kind of a couple brief comments. One, I love this. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. The things I love about it are, I love that it's looking at, for all the same reasons that you talked about the importance of studying urban wildlife, it's looking at how we are part of nature and we're all coexisting together. How can we all be better neighbors to each other? Like, we humans don't always think of our wild counterparts as our neighbors, but I love that that's essentially this study is looking at our neighbors, our wild neighbors. I love that. So Sarah and I teach science communication workshops, and I feel like so many grad students, other scientists could benefit from listening to your style of delivery, because you hit all the nails on the head. You include stories, you make your language accessible. I just love it so much. So thank you so much. This presentation was great. I'm so excited I got to hear it. I'm so excited all of our Biophilia crew that have been sticking with us virtually through the pandemic got to join us for this as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's very flattering. I always enjoy talking to different groups like yourselves. And you know, I feel like there's a general upswell across our culture and people are interested in this. And during COVID, I kind of thought, oh man, I'm gonna have to lay low for a few years because the last thing in anyone's mind is going to be urban wildlife. But it was actually the opposite. I got more media requests and sort of calls about urban wildlife during COVID than I ever had before. And I think that when people were cooped up inside, they realized how badly they needed these nature connections, even ones that I think they weren't thinking about, like, oh, I walk, down the street and I see a squirrel, or I hear birdsong on my way to the train or whatever. I think they really missed that. And I think it's become very obvious to everyone that nature has a role in everyone's life, no matter where you live. Nature has a role in your life. And yeah, so it's been exciting to sort of be part of this movement to try to encourage that to grow.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again so much, Seth. It was great to hear about your work, and we're so glad you could join us tonight. And thanks everyone out there. Hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Phipps, for doing these talks. They're so helpful and they're so inspiring.
Thanks so much, Bob. It's good to see you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks again, Seth. That was great.
I was just
Sure,
gonna
yeah.